There was a small town where life seemed frozen in time. There wasn't much to do but work on the farm or get into trouble. Everyone knew everyone, and secrets were rare. At least, that's what they believed. For John, though, the predictability was suffocating. He longed for something different, something that could prove there was more to life than endless routines and the same dull faces. In high school, John did just enough to get by. He kept his grades acceptable to avoid lectures from his parents, but he refused to waste time on clubs or extracurricular activities. They felt like distractions from the only thing that mattered, escaping this dead-end town. Running was his one solace. As he sprinted down the empty roads, he counted the cars passing by, each one a reminder that there was a world out there waiting for him. But not everything in town was ordinary. On its outskirts lay a mysterious forest, enclosed by rusting private property signs and high fences that warned trespassers to stay away. Rumors swirled about the forest, growing more sinister with each retelling. Some claimed that anyone who entered was never seen again. Others spoke of buried treasure or strange rituals. The truth, most believed, was more mundane. It was probably just logging land owned by someone long forgotten. Still, the forest had a presence, a quiet allure that tugged at John's curiosity. Whenever he ran past it, the towering trees seemed to call to him, their shadows stretching like fingers over the ground. What if, John wondered, there's more to this place than anyone knows? One moonless night, John decided to find out. He waited until the town was asleep, then slipped into his carefully planned outfit: black pants, a black long-sleeve shirt, a hat, and his trusty headlamp. With a pair of hiking boots and a nervous excitement in his chest, he set off toward the edge of town. The forest loomed ahead, its silhouette darker than the night sky. As John stepped past the broken "No Trespassing" sign, the air felt different, colder, heavier. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots echoed too loudly in the stillness. He glanced over his shoulder once, then twice, but the road behind him was empty. At first, the forest seemed unremarkable, just trees and shadows, the same as every other wooded area he'd seen. He began to doubt the stories, thinking maybe this was just another boring piece of land like everything else in town. Then came the sound, a sharp crack followed by a loud bang, shattering the silence. John froze, his breath caught in his throat. His headlamp scanned the trees, the beam bouncing wildly as he tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. Fear flickered in the back of his mind, but curiosity quickly drowned it out. He ran toward the sound, weaving through the dense trees until he found its source. A massive tree had fallen, its roots torn from the ground, its trunk splintered. But it wasn't the tree that caught his attention. Someone had been here. Fresh footprints were pressed into the dirt, leading deeper into the forest. Nearby, a clearing opened up. The underbrush was trampled, and a small pond reflected the pale glow of his headlamp. It looked like a watering hole for animals, but something about it felt wrong. John thought of the cars around town, the ones often dented and smeared with faint streaks of blood. He had always assumed they hit deer or other wildlife. But standing here, in this place where someone else had clearly been, the thought lingered. What if it wasn't just animals? He pressed on, the trees growing denser as he moved. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the paths twisting and unfamiliar. Just as he was about to turn back, the beam of his headlamp caught something in the distance, a structure, barely visible through the thick trees. As he approached, the shape became clearer, a cabin. It was larger than his house, weathered but not completely abandoned. The windows were intact, and the steps leading to the porch sagged but held firm. John climbed the steps carefully, each one creaking under his weight. "Hello," he called, his voice barely louder than a whisper. The silence swallowed his words. Then he turned and saw it, through the perfect gap in the trees. He could see the familiar path he always ran along. It was perfectly framed, like a painting. His skin prickled. Had someone been watching him? Shaking off the thought, John turned back to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the stench of decay. The interior was cramped, the layout cluttered. Half-eaten food sat on a table, its edges curled with rot. Someone had been here recently. Just as John turned to leave, his name echoed through the room. "John!" The whisper was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. His breath caught. His headlamp flickered. Before he could react, a wave of dizziness hit him, his vision swimming as the floor tilted beneath him. He staggered, reaching for something, anything, to steady himself. Then, just as darkness closed in, he saw the figure, a man, standing in the doorway, watching him. At first, John thought it was just the dizziness playing tricks on him. His vision blurred for a moment, the dim beam of his headlamp barely illuminating the figure in the shadows. The man stood perfectly still, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, his body cloaked in darkness. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound composed. He took a step back, his boots creaking on the warped floorboards. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as though he were studying John, deciding something. John's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating, as though the forest itself had come alive and was pressing down on him. The man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, almost a growl. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill down John's spine. He managed to find his voice, though it cracked as he spoke. I didn't mean to trespass. I'll leave." The man stepped forward, and as he did, the light from John's headlamp fell on his face. But there was no face, just a black void where features should have been, an emptiness that seemed to draw the light in and swallow it whole. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. What are you?" The man, or whatever it was, didn't answer. Instead, the cabin around them seemed to shift and warp, the walls closing in, the air growing colder. John turned to bolt out the door, but it was no longer there. The cabin had transformed into a maze of dark hallways, each one stretching endlessly into the void. He ran blindly, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, shapes that moved just out of reach of his light. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing his name over and over. "John, John, John." He stopped, his back pressed against a cold, damp wall, and tried to catch his breath. The whispers grew closer, until they were right in his ear. Then, in the darkness, he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, red and malevolent, staring at him from the end of the hallway. "Leave!" The voice growled, the word reverberating through the walls, to be told twice. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he sprinted down the hallway, the glowing eyes chasing him, growing brighter and closer with every step. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away. Finally, he burst through a door and found himself outside. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The forest was eerily quiet, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The cabin was gone, as though it had never been there. John scrambled to his feet and ran, not stopping until he was back in town. When he finally reached his house, he locked every door and window and sat trembling in his room, the events of the night replaying in his mind. The next morning, he told no one about what had happened. The forest, the cabin, the man, it all felt like a bad dream. But as he laced up his running shoes and stepped outside, he froze. Sitting on the porch was a small, weathered note. In jagged handwriting, it read, "We're always watching." John glanced toward the edge of the forest, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. For the first time in his life, the thought of leaving town didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a necessity, but deep down he knew he would never truly escape.